there was an evening when he was invited to be a pianist for an organisation called the National Council of Jewish Women. And they were raising money to bring refugees to Australia, and he was the pianist. And my grandmother, Lillian Kloot, who was one of the founding members of National Council of Jewish Women, was one of the organisers of this concert. And my mum was a junior member of National Council of Jewish Women, and that's where my mum and dad met. She had just been through a broken engagement, and she wasn't really looking for love at that stage, but Dad kept asking her out. And he actually asked her to marry him 6 times. And the day when she finally agreed to marry him was the day then he shared this terrible letter that had come from the Red Cross, that he'd lost his parents. And at that stage she felt, he really wants to marry me, he needs to set up a new family. For all the refugees, I think starting a new family, starting over again, trying to replace to some degree the people who'd been lost was terribly important. So my parents got married, and they got married in September 1943. They went on and had 5 children, 4 sons and then me. It wasn't the happiest marriage because my Mum grew up in an English Jewish family and Dad grew up in a German Jewish family. And culturally they were worlds apart. But they did find places where they could share values and share the things that they did have in common. And they were married for 50 years. Once they were married, my dad set up a business very much like what his father and grandfather's business had been. He made embossed showcards. My mother had been working from the age of 14 because she grew up in the Great Depression. And as well as helping her parents to keep their house, she had managed to save up £100. It was enough to put a deposit on a house in those days, but she gave it to my father, and with it he bought his first printing press, which he then was able to adapt to be an embossing machine. So he set up the embossed showcards business. He used his German name, Feuerstein, and I'll tell you just a bit about that in a minute. This is something that he wrote in 1960. He said, "Since the earliest days of graphic arts, embossing has been used to enhance, dignify and embellish the printed piece." And he wrote that in 1960, and it was actually used in an exhibition of industry in Victoria in the 20th century. When before Dad passed away, he gave all of his samples from all of his years in business to the Victorian State Library. And they used quite a few of those in this exhibition about industry in Victoria in the 20th century. And it was really quite amazing because having been making showcards since the early 1940s in Australia, he had showcards of so many of the famous brands from back then, and it was really a beautiful thing to see. I grew up in a suburb called Blackrock, and gorgeous suburb. We were within walking distance of the beach. But in those days, it wasn't a wealthy suburb. Now you need buckets of money to buy into Blackrock, but in those days it wasn't like that at all. We had a very old, drafty timber house, but my dad bought it because it was on the top of a hill. And the first house that my mum and dad had lived in was at the bottom of a hill, And in those days, houses were being built without any kind of drainage. So every time it rained, there was a lake under the house. And my eldest brother, Leon, he was named after his grandfather, always had ear infections. And the doctor finally said to my mum, if this kid's ever going to get healthy, you have to move out of this house. So that's why Dad bought the house in Blackrock. It was an interesting area in terms of there being no other Jewish families in my area. In both the primary school that I went to and the high school that I went to, I was the only Jewish student. There were 1,000 students at my high school. It turns out that there was one young man growing up with me who was Jewish, but he didn't know it, and his name was Christopher. And there was another girl who had a Jewish dad and a non-Jewish mum. The reason Christopher found out he was Jewish was that they had this big get-together of the family members. And in Jewish law, if you have a Jewish mother, you're Jewish. And he had a Jewish mother. And we had a reunion after 35 years of my class. We were the class of 1972. And he told me, Christopher came up, and he was so excited to tell me that he'd found out that he was Jewish. But he certainly didn't know at the time. I feel like I grew up in a time of absolute grace in Australia, where there was some anti-Semitism, but it wasn't a big, nasty thing like in the European countries. It was very much under the radar. It affected me in the sense that there was a girl in my street who I really liked, and she liked me. And for a long time she wasn't allowed to play with me because I was Jewish. And when her parents finally relented, I was allowed to play in the garden with Virginia, but I was not allowed to enter the house. So yes, there was some anti-Semitism like that. I remember some kids jumping out from behind a tree one day and calling me Jew, 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 Jew. But it was not an everyday thing by any means. It just really didn't come into life, mostly, that other people didn't really like Jews. But we knew that Dad had escaped Germany, that his family hadn't. We were taught, my mum taught us about anti-Semitism historically. My mum was a passionate reader of history, but she didn't weigh us down with huge amounts of it, certainly not when we were young. All my friends were non-Jewish because that was my cohort. And I was very happy. I was so happy at school. And I was not embarrassed to tell people that I was Jewish, not at all. There was one boy in my class in high school who, when we had to line up before class, would annoy me and, Jew, 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 like that. And my mum came up to the principal of the school and spoke to him. And that boy was told, "You're not allowed to do that. That's not okay." And he stopped. There was one time that really upset me. In my school, there were lots of stray dogs that would come to eat whatever was left on the ground when the kids had finished lunch. And every now and then, the principal would call the dog catcher from the local council. And one day, the dog catcher was there catching a large Labrador dog that we all adored. And there were students who made a circle around the dog catcher and his vehicle and the dog. And they were shouting, "Jew, Jew, Jew, Jew." They weren't shouting it at me, but it upset me so much because I realised that that was the worst word that they could think of. And that really upset me. Of course, the dog catcher took the dog was put down, And the kids were upset because they knew that was what was going to be the fate of the dog. However, I was invited to talk sometimes about some of the things that went on in a Jewish house. I was certainly not put down by 99.9% of my cohort, and I was very happy. I had one very interesting experience, though, with a girl who was a passionate Christian, and there was a group of Christians that met under the floor of our school hall. It was like this quite light, the school hall was built up high area, and she invited me to come, and the students that were there were all talking about their personal experiences with Jesus. And I just listened, and when it was all over, this girl said to me, "Are you going to accept Jesus?" And I said, "No. How could you not accept Jesus when you've heard what these people have said?" And I said, "Because it's not my faith. It's not the way I've been brought up." And she told me that I'd had the opportunity, and when I die, I will burn in hell. And I've actually used that as a story in the book that I'm writing about my aunt, because there are some fictional stories in that. And I didn't understand where she was coming from. But one of my friends that I made from my year, well, she was from my year too, but there were 7 classes, so it was a big year. He became one of my very, very best friends, and he went on to become an Anglican minister. And his name was Grant, and he came up to me when his class and my class had a cooking class together, and we sat down to eat the scones or whatever we'd made. And he said to me, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Are rabbis allowed to marry?" I said, "Yeah." So we had this big talk. He was part of the Anglican Church, and Anglican priests are allowed to marry, but he was very fascinated because he was also very conscious of the whole Catholic Church celibate priests thing, and he was fascinated. I said to him, "Actually, rabbis are supposed to marry. They're supposed to be family men." So he found that very interesting. And we were in year 9 then, and we became friends, and we're still friends on Facebook. We don't see each other very often, but we're still friends. But I asked him about this girl, and he explained to me and why she felt that way. And he and I talked religion till the end of year 12, and sometimes we skipped classes after lunch to talk religion. So he was one of my very best experiences, but my whole year, really, apart from a couple of people, I was incredibly happy where I grew up. So my mother was the person who imbued in all of us, or tried to imbue in all of us, a sense of faith, a comfortableness about God. She taught me to pray. But as well as that, we all went to a Jewish Sunday school, and it was on a Sunday. It wasn't on a Saturday, which is when Jews have their Sabbath service. It was on a Sunday, I think, just for reasons of convenience, and also because, like, there are lots of things you don't do on the Sabbath if you're an observant Jew. You don't write, for example. You can read holy texts, no problem, but you're not meant to take notes and write and stuff like that. So we went to Sunday school, and I stayed until I was 14, which was the upper limit. There was no Sunday school after that. There was a girl and I who went to the rabbi and asked if we could have another year at Sunday school because we were enjoying the learning. And he said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't think I could find you a teacher." So for me, Sunday school was something I really enjoyed. I really loved learning about my religion. In my home, Friday night was a really big deal. For Jewish people, the Sabbath, the holy days go from sundown to sundown. Or in the case of the Sabbath and all the really special holidays, from sundown till you can see the first 3 stars the following night, which is 25 hours. Friday night particularly, we sat around the Sabbath table. We did the Sabbath rituals of my mum lighting Sabbath candles, my dad saying a little prayer over wine, and we would drink some sweet sacramental wine, and my dad saying a prayer over bread, and we would eat the bread. In Judaism, wine is a symbol of joy and enjoyment. We're not supposed to get drunk in Judaism. That doesn't mean that people don't, but and interestingly, there's even a couple of times in the year where it's accepted that people get drunk, but for most of the time we're not supposed to. But the wine represents enjoyment, and the bread represents food. So it's in the Middle East, the bread still is the staff of life, the most foundational food, which is quite different to Asia, where the most foundational food is rice. And so the bread on our table, which is a plaited loaf, is symbolic of food in general. And it's a plaited loaf because in the times when the Jewish temple stood in Jerusalem, they had a large number of trays of these plaited loaves every day. There were fresh ones, not only on the Sabbath, but every day. So it was always a beautiful meal, a roast meal, and we were not allowed to go out on a Friday night. It was our night to be at home. My parents together joined what's called a liberal synagogue. The liberal movement has been through several names. These days it's called progressive. It was where my parents found a common home. My mum had been brought up in an Orthodox Jewish family. My dad had been brought up in a very secular Jewish family in Germany. It's not that they didn't attend the synagogue, but they only attended on major festival days, and they weren't careful about what they eat. Like, they didn't obey the dietary laws at all. So it was a very secular kind of life. And when my parents got married, they got married in an Orthodox synagogue, and that's actually all that was available in Melbourne in 1943. But after the war, a rabbi came from, I don't know his whole survival story, but he came from Europe, and he was part of the early liberal movement, which had started, I don't know, about 100 years before. And the liberal movement did very different things. They followed the same order of the service, but they cut lots of bits out of the prayers. They tried to make the synagogue service more like a church service, in that you could get through it in about an hour, whereas an Orthodox service has so many prayers and so many repetitions of prayers that if it's done slowly, it can take 3 hours. In my synagogue here in Brisbane, where we have someone who's not singing the prayers, who's not a cantor, he gets through it in about an hour and a half. He just reads the prayers very quickly and people join in. But this liberal rabbi, his name was Rev Dr Sanger, so he also had a PhD, and he started the first liberal synagogue in Melbourne. And my parents found a real home in that synagogue. They loved it because Mum loved it because a lot of the prayers were said in English, and she had never been taught Hebrew properly. My dad loved it also because he hadn't been taught Hebrew properly, and he enjoyed hearing some of the prayers in English, and also because they could sit together, whereas in an Orthodox synagogue, the men and women have to sit separately. So there was a lot about it they loved. They adored Rabbi Dr Sanger. I thought he gave very long sermons, but I was a child. They thought he gave very intellectual, wonderful and interesting sermons, and they probably were. Anyway, so that was their spiritual home, and that was something that helped to bring them together. But one of the consequences of choosing to be liberal Jews was that the Saturday, which is actually all the Sabbath, not just Friday night, was just another day in our house. They really didn't they didn't go to the synagogue on the Saturday, and my brothers just all did their own things. I did my own thing, but they were older than me. They were driving cars before me. Driving cars is something we're not supposed to do on the Sabbath. I won't give you a whole lesson on why not, but that was, and even when my parents did go to the synagogue, they had to drive because it was about 10 miles. So that was our life, and we kept the Friday nights. Passover was really, really important, and Passover is the most widely kept Jewish festival kept by Jews around the world. Even if they're not very religious in the way they live, recounting the story of the Exodus from Egypt is really important to them. And it's a very beautiful night where, again, we have a big festive meal. There's lots of laws around what we can eat, what we should eat, what we can't eat. We don't eat leavened bread on any of the 8 days of Passover, because the story in the Bible says that the Jews left Egypt and were baking the bread on their backs as they left. They didn't have time to leaven the bread and let it rise. Because when Pharaoh of Egypt finally said, after 10 plagues, "Get out of my country," he meant now, or I'll kill you. And they did leave, and they left in a big hurry, and he still decided to send his army after them a day or so later, with the intention of killing them. And the whole story about the Exodus from Egypt is a story of miracles, the miracle of the water of the Red Sea rising and the Jews being able to make their way through on dry land. And then Pharaoh's army came in chariots with horses, and the water came down and they were drowned. It's not a nice story, but it's one of the miracles of Passover. The story of Passover is the foundational story of Judaism, that God took this people who were descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had become slaves in Egypt, took them out of Egypt and gave them the Torah, which is the Jewish Bible, the first 5 books of Moses. Moses was their leader. So people keep that festival because it goes to the very foundation of who we are. And the other days that my parents kept were Jewish New Year, which is a big deal in Judaism as well, and the Day of Atonement. Jewish New Year is a time we are told that God is going to judge us for the way we have been in the last 12 months. And we will either be metaphorically written in the book of life, or we won't. And, our stories tell us that God decides who's going to live and who's going to die in the next year. It's all based on how we have acted towards people. And the whole of the month before Jewish New Year, the month of Elul, is a month where we are meant to really search our souls, apologise to people that we've wronged, really think about who we are and how we could improve ourselves. And then there are 10 days from Jewish New Year until the Day of Atonement. So those 10 days are meant to be even more intensive introspection. So introspection is a very important skill if you're a Jew. And we are told that God has judged us on Jewish New Year, but we have up to the 10 days and the Day of Atonement, which is a day when we collectively pray for forgiveness. We pray as a community. We say, for the sin which we have sinned by lying, for the sin which we have sinned by killing someone. And there's lots and lots and lots of these different sins. And I can remember growing up and saying, I haven't killed anybody. I don't even know anybody who's killed anybody. Why do we say that? But there are two reasons why some of the things seem very, very unlikely, like killing someone. And one is that you're praying for your whole community, and maybe somebody in your community has committed a murder. But more importantly, there are all these rabbinic explanations, and we are told that if you speak badly about a person, there's a term in Hebrew, lashon hara, speaking with an evil tongue. If you speak with an evil tongue about somebody, you're told that your words are like leaves on the wind, and once they've left your mouth, they can never be brought back. And speaking badly about another person is equivalent to killing them, because you don't know how much damage those words are going to cause as they get passed around. So there's a lot of stuff in Jewish tradition about not speaking badly, and of course on the Day of Atonement we say, for the sin which we have sinned against you with, words of the mouth, for running to tell tales, for speaking badly about a neighbour. Like, it's repeated and repeated and repeated. And there are also sins about being dishonest in business. And people say, like my dad, he had a lot of faults, but he was definitely the most honest man in business it's possible to be. And I thought, why do we have to say that? But there are people who are dishonest in business, but it was explained to me that even if you go into a shop and somebody gives you back too much change and you notice it and you don't say, oh, look, you've given me too much, that's like being dishonest in business. So all of these things that we collectively pray for, we do over the Day of Atonement, which is a very strict fast day. It's 25 hours from sundown to the next night when we can see 3 stars, and we're not allowed to eat or drink. It's difficult. Not drinking is the difficult part. However, there are leniencies also for people who are ill, for breastfeeding mothers, for people that have to take medications. So, the rabbis provide all these sort of degrees of how strictly you have to do it. Interestingly, a lot of old Jewish people who do have to take pills and shouldn't be fasting still fast without drinking, because it's so much a part of who they are and they just want to do it. So those were the main days for my family. There are other days in the Jewish year that are very important. That sometimes they'd go to the synagogue, but they weren't a big deal in our house. Also, my mother made a point of saying we don't eat pork and we don't eat shellfish and we don't eat rabbit, which are 3 forbidden foods for Jews. However, as I was growing up, I realised that my father's Don Danish salami had pork in it. And I told him. He didn't want to know. And I started bringing him kosher wurst, it's called. It's a salami, but it's called wurst. But he didn't like it as much as his Don Danish, so that was okay. We didn't eat shellfish, we didn't eat rabbit, and we certainly never sat down to like a pork chop or something like that. So there was this leniency, because that's what my father had grown up with in Germany. Pork sausages were what you ate. So, so it was a sort of a bit of a mishmash, my family, in terms of what we kept and what we didn't. I have mentioned, I don't know if it was here or earlier, that we had an adopted grandfather, and he was just the most wonderful man in my life, in all of our lives. And he became our friend because he was a minister of the Congregational Church in Blackrock, and he was one of the people that went to Blackrock Primary School to teach religious instruction. And my mum had written a note to the school asking that my twin brothers, who were 5.5 years older than me, could do something else at RE time, that they didn't have to be included in RE. And his name was Pastor William Leech, and he didn't understand why these boys couldn't come to RE. So he came and knocked on our door one day, and my mum invited him in, and they chatted, and she explained to him that we were Jewish, and I think we were probably the first Jewish people he'd ever met, and, you know, that she was giving her children a Jewish upbringing, or that both she and my dad were giving the children a Jewish upbringing. Not that my dad was ever part of those conversations, but he was certainly part of the traditional things that we did. And my mum and Will Leech became very, very good friends, very quickly. And she told him about our Sabbath evening meals. And she invited him, would he like to come to one? And would he like to bring his wife? And he said he would love to come to one. He couldn't bring his wife. His wife had some terrible terminal disease. I don't know what it was. I don't know if they even knew what it was. I met her very briefly one day. I still have a picture of her in the bed, being a very frail looking woman. Anyway, he came to a Friday night dinner at our house, and he loved it. And he asked my mum and dad if he could come again. And they said, you can come whenever you like. And for about the next 20 years, he came pretty much every Friday night. He had someone to look after Gertie. He came, he enjoyed the meal, he enjoyed the whole thing about the candles and the wine and the bread. He enjoyed conversation with my parents because they were both very interesting, intelligent people. And also my dad would play the piano on a Friday night. Now, in an Orthodox home, you don't do that. You're not allowed to actually play musical instruments on the Sabbath. We're told that we can't play musical instruments on the Sabbath until the temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, because they used to play a wide range of beautiful musical instruments in the temple on the Sabbath. So sadly, in an Orthodox home, you don't play music on the Sabbath. But in my parents' liberal Jewish home, that was fine. And in fact, in their synagogue, someone played the organ on the Sabbath. In fact, my nephew still goes and plays the organ on a Sabbath for them quite often. So he loved that too. He loved the music. So he would stay till about, I don't know, we usually sat down at about 6 and he'd stay till about 8:30 and then he'd go home. Pop would sit down. I could ride my bike round to his place. He'd make me we'd make a pot of tea and we'd sit down and have a yarn. So he was the significant elder for me. My brothers all had close relationships with him. I don't know if they spent as much time around at his place as I did. He had hobbies that I adored. He was a person who painted china, and he had a kiln, and he would show me whatever he'd been recently painting. And so I knew all about multiple firings and, and he had pictures of Jesus all around his house. And I was totally comfortable with that too. I knew that we didn't. I knew that there were these two religions, and I'd been brought up in this one, and Pop belonged in this one, and Grant belonged in that one, and that's okay.